Okay, now we're going to turn to quotas and tradable allowances. A quota is just like a price control. A price control, like a price ceiling or a price floor, it fixes maximum or minimum prices. Quotas establish maximum or minimum quantities. Quotas, though, can be a little different because they can be consumption quotas and they can be production quotas. Production quotas are you have to produce a maximum amount or a minimum amount. A consumption quota is you have to consume a minimum amount or you can't consume any more than a maximum amount. So we have maximum versus minimum. We have production versus consumption. Let's start with minimum. So if we establish a minimum production quota, much like a price floor, which is only meaningful if it is set above the equilibrium price, a minimum quota is only meaningful if it's set above the minimum quantity. So I'm going to write min for quantity. Unfortunately, min and max both begin with M, so I can't write QM because you won't know what it is. Forcing quantity higher than our equilibrium creates dead weight loss. We have a quantity greater than the equilibrium quantity, which means we are consuming and producing, even though the costs of producing are greater than the benefits of consuming. That's dead weight loss. The price, though, was an interesting point. You see that we intersect at two different points. We intersect at supply and we intersect at demand. And the question is, which is the one we care about? That's where this production versus consumption comes into play. If it is a minimum consumption quota, it's saying that people everywhere have to consume a minimum amount of this good, like, say, a national mandate for health insurance. We might call it min C. Right? C for consumption, min for minimum. Well, if you're forcing consumption all the way out there, then that means the production has to climb up that marginal cost curve, that supply curve. So our equilibrium price is all the way up here. Higher, of course, than our optimal. In contrast, if we say that there is a minimum production quota, min P, that means you're forcing a lot, by law, you're forcing a lot of people to make this thing. And you're flooding the market. And that causes prices to fall through all this additional supply, all this additional quantity supplied, I should say. And then instead, we use this intersection point to find our price. So naturally, forcing people to consume a lot more than they normally would cause prices to rise. And forcing them to produce a lot more than they normally would cause prices to fall. Again, this point, when it's production, doesn't really mean anything. Miles. Good night. Miles is my younger son. The minimum production, this doesn't mean anything because the idea of what determines how much is out there of that cost structure is sort of set aside. Granted, this might be the cost to produce that unit, that still matters and that's still helpful for finding dead weight loss. But for purposes of finding price, we simply reference, well, how much do we have given that demand? Just like we figured out the quantity supplied and quantity demanded by checking where price intersected supply and demand. Now we're figuring out what the price is based on where this quantity intersects demand or supply. Maximum quotas operate in the same basic way. a minimum quota doesn't mean anything when it's below equilibrium. It means something when it's above equilibrium. You have to produce or consume a certain amount. Well, this symmetry applies the other way too. A maximum price is a ceiling. It doesn't mean anything when it's all the way up here. It's only meaningful when it's down here. You can't go above the ceiling. And at the same time, maximum production quotas don't mean anything when they're all the way over here, when they're really, really high. Oh, you can't produce above a certain level. Who cares? I want to be down here. They only mean something when they're a lot lower. And just like minimum quotas set above equilibrium quantity create deadweight loss, maximum quotas below equilibrium create deadweight loss. Because we do not consume even though the benefits are greater than the costs. Just as before, it matters if we're talking about a consumption maximum or production maximum. We have these 2 points of intersection. If it is a consumption maximum, people or companies or whoever the buyer is can't purchase any more than a particular amount, then that forces prices down. So again, the consumption wouldn't make sense to map the consumption to demand. It makes sense to map the consumption to the supply, to the production. Naturally, if you don't allow people to buy stuff, that's going to bring things down. Similarly, if you say you can't produce any more than a particular thing, well, that restrained availability is going to push prices higher. So one example, for example, of max production quotas. So during the Great Depression, one of the big problems during the Great Depression were falling prices. Right? That doesn't seem like a big deal, but of course, if you know your macro, if there's falling prices across the entire economy, that also means that's falling wages too. People weren't making as enough. And so there was a lot of concern about overproduction as the cause of the crisis. Now, of course, that was incorrect, but at the time they didn't know that. And so part of the New Deal, there were a lot of laws put in place, the New Deal, to try to constrain production, to try to bring how much people are producing lower, and thus bring prices higher. And it did succeed at that. But of course, because that was not the problem, it didn't really solve the Great Depression. There are cases in the Great Depression of setting these quotas, these maximum productions on steel mills, on farmers, on all kinds of sectors across the economy, forcing prices higher. What's the point of talking about quotas here? It's because quotas are also another way to solve externalities. So here is our negative externality diagram, just like we've talked about before. And we realize that that problem, essentially, is that the quantity that people naturally do is higher than the quantity we would like them to do, and thus creating this area of deadweight loss. Well, in a well-functioning market, quotas create deadweight loss, assuming that they have an impact. Again, maximums below equilibrium, minimums above equilibrium. So if they have that kind of impact, they create deadweight loss. But just like a tax applied to a negative externality can remove deadweight loss by bringing quantity lower, a quota can also remove deadweight loss by bringing quantity lower. If we know where the optimal should be, and then we're here, we can just simply establish a law. Don't do more of this than X. So rather than creating deadweight loss, it eliminates it. Now, this becomes kind of an issue, though, doing it this way, because this is a genuine question. Okay, we as a group or as an industry, we're not supposed to produce more than X, but how much should any one person produce? How do you figure out which
industries should do the producing and which ones should not be doing the producing? How do you figure out who should hold back and who should make more? How do you figure out when you want the people who are best at it, people who can do the most with how much they can be producing to do it? How do you sort that out? So to give you a practical example of this, consider acid rain. Acid rain was the result of SO2 emissions or sulfur dioxide emissions from industry. They knew that this was the problem of acid rain. It destroyed forests, it hurt wildlife. It was a major negative externality from these factories and power plants that were making this. So I said, okay, we get an idea of how much the environment can tolerate. So let's say you cannot emit any more SO2 than this block, like this amount. And then what you do is you create these permits, these allowances that say you can emit, maybe the maximum that we can do for the entire country might be 10,000 tons or whatever it would be. And then each one of these permits says you have the right to permit 1 ton. You can emit 1 ton of this pollution. In other words, you've established private property. You have the right to pollute. And you can sell this right to others. This is kind of an application of the coast there, right? This externality can then be eliminated by creating some sort of tradable allowances, by creating some sort of bargaining opportunity. And so the people who have the hardest time adapting to pollution, who can do the most with that permit, would then pay the most for that. And thus you create a market. This is a system of what we call tradable allowances. It allows people to buy and sell a share of quota. We can do a similar thing too with fishing. This happens with fishing, where there's a certain amount of fish that the school can sustain, because if you overfish, then you destroy the fish, right? That's strategy of the commons. But there's a certain amount that's maybe just at that replacement rate or a little bit lower, just to be sure. And then you give people the right to fish or the right to extract a certain amount of fish, and then you allow them to buy and sell and trade these permits. And the people who are best at fishing, who can maybe make sure that the least amount is spoiled, or that can sell it the best, or can find it the most efficient, or have the best way of pulling it out, they're willing to pay the most for these permits. And therefore, the people who are best at using what we've constrained is that we can only use this amount. We can only do this amount. We can only take out this amount or put in this amount. The people who can make the most out of that narrowed space will end up with the permits. As a side note too, if you think the permits are wrong, if you think that they set 10,000 tons of pollution or that catch X tons of fish, and you think that is way too much, you as a private person can purchase one of these permits yourself and just not use it. And then in practice, the total amount actually goes down. And environmental groups can purchase sulfur dioxide permits and just not use them. They can purchase the right to fish and just not use it. And thus, rather than relying on governments which are swingy and subject to a lot of politics, and maybe the administration changes or something and the rules don't apply anymore, and it's all either you win everything or you get nothing. There's this half step that is very reliable. This market that you can always partake in because it's not contingent on connections or political force or the vicissitudes of politics. Now, there is a major weakness to using quotas to solve negative externalities, and that's the same problem as the Pigouvian tax or Pigouvian subsidy. And that's the problem of measurement. Sometimes it's hard to figure out what the optimal level is. You could argue it might be easier than figuring out what the size of the externality is. Like with fish, for example, I think it's relatively easy to figure out, how many fish you can take out because you get an idea of the breeding and everything. But for something like sulfur dioxide, that's a little trickier. For something like global warming, which is worldwide, that's very hard because even if one country constrains it, there could still be a big problem since maybe other countries won't be. And that's what makes global warming such a unique challenge for the economists and for policymakers and for anyone who wants to try to make the world a better place, is it's global, and it requires cooperation on all countries, or at least all the major ones that are major polluters. The United States is certainly a big polluter. It certainly needs to take a role, a leadership role, and we have some tools in our economics toolkit to help us solve that. And it's nice to have multiple tools. It's nice to have multiple options. So again, quotas in a well-functioning market, they create problems. Assuming it's a maximum below equilibrium or a minimum above equilibrium, don't deal with it. But as a way to solve an externality problem, or some other market failure where the optimal quantity and the equilibrium quantity don't match up, it might be a way to get them to match up by forcing it, assuming you can figure out the details. Thanks.